an emotional eating and weight loss coach for women, looking to fall in love with eating, create healthy attachments with food, and lose weight sustainably. Welcome to today's episode on how to become accountable to ourselves from a place of self-love. I love this topic, and today we'll uncover how this practice of intrinsic accountability can be developed and implemented on a consistent basis. So, what is intrinsic accountability? So, intrinsic accountability, or being accountable to oneself, means taking ownership of your actions, taking ownership of your choices, and taking ownership of your well being without the pressure of some dogmatic rule or external system, right? Something outside of ourselves, like a diet or a meal plan, right? So we don't have that external pressure where we feel the fear of God, right? Like if we do it wrong or we're worried we're going to disappoint someone else. This is accountability that comes from the inside. And ultimately, we want the motivation for our goals, for our commitments to ourselves, and for our follow through with our goals and our commitments to ourselves to come from the inside, right? So we want our energy towards our commitments to come from inside of us. And this practice of authentic self-leadership, which essentially is what intrinsic accountability is, will give you a much greater sense of self-trust, self-respect, and ultimately self-confidence. You'll have that like peace, that grounded sense of confidence. And those things, that is the recipe. Self-trust, self-respect, and self-confidence, that is the recipe for everything that you need to feel empowered eating and sustain lasting weight loss, right? And by developing the verified proof and the belief system that we can trust ourselves to follow through on our intentions and goals without relying on those external accountability measures, we build a foundation to make eating choices that align with our values and give us that elusive permission, right? We think that permission has to come from the outside, but really it comes from the inside to enjoy what we truly want without guilt, right? So that is the outcome of building this internal architecture of intrinsic accountability, right? So I'm excited because I know that for me, this was a game changer, right? When I started to make eating decisions, when I started to make choices, when I started to hold myself to a higher standard that came from my intrinsic accountability, that came from this sense of self, this real sense of I'm taking radical responsibility for my actions. That's when things really started to change for me. That's when I lost weight for good. That's when I started to be able to really eat all the foods that I used to have all these rules around. I used to be able to eat them without guilt, without fear. And so this is why this topic specifically is so important to me and is really such an important skill, because it is a skill really that I teach my clients within my framework, right? And this is something that you can't really teach in theory, right? You can't theoretically teach somebody how to build intrinsic accountability. It's something that's born from lived experience, but approaching lived experience in a new way, right? It's bringing curiosity to your experiences, learning from it, and then that's almost like a repetition, right? You have an experience, you learn from it, and from that experience, the juice of that is intrinsic accountability if you choose to see it that way. Okay, so what is intrinsic accountability and how do we get it, right? When we think of accountability proper, right? When we think of being accountable, it's usually in the context of being accountable to someone else, right? Accountability is like, it's inherently codependent, actually, sometimes, right? It's like, oh, I'm accountable to this. I'm accountable to this thing. I'm accountable to this diet that I'm on. I'm accountable to this program. I'm accountable to my trainer. I'm accountable to my coach, right? So there's all of these external things that we're accountable for. And then we could say, like, I'm accountable to this, therefore I'm sourcing the energy of my behaviors that's aligned with my goals from this fear of not doing the accountability right? So really what happens is the reason that we're getting the energy to do the quote unquote good action, the right action for ourselves, is because we are outsourcing the responsibility, right? Or we're outsourcing the consequences. That we think that we're going to have consequences that are negative because they're going to come from outside of us. Someone's going to be disappointed in us. I'm going to be embarrassed, or I'm not going to do it right, right? So there are these external things that are giving us that juice, that energy to follow through. And ultimately, what happens when we source our accountability externally is that it isn't sustainable, right? Ultimately, it leads to exhaustion. The idea of being, it starts to feel like an obligation. We start to feel suffocated. We start to ironically, all of our fears and limiting beliefs start to come up, right? We start to feel unseen. We start to feel like it starts to feel very suffocating, ultimately. And that's what happens when we outsource accountability. So intrinsic accountability, alternatively, is born from your own relationship to your experiences and how they truly make you feel, right? So intrinsic accountability it's born from showing up to your life with this beginner's mind, right? And it's making decisions and being willing to be honest about how those decisions make you feel, right? So it's born from your own relationship to your experiences. That includes your decisions and how your decisions make you feel, and taking full responsibility for your own participation and choice, and not backing away from that, not fearing that, right? And from there, you learn where your accountability edge is, right? So from there, you can learn where your edge is when you go too far, right? So you can learn where your accountability, where you can usually from going past your accountability edge, right? So intrinsic accountability is born from your own relationship to your experiences and how they truly make you feel, right? You learn where your accountability edge is, and you do that usually from going past the edge, right? And being willing to admit to yourself that going too far made you feel bad, right? So you have to be willing to stay awake during these experiences, like a binge, right? Like an overeating session, right? Like a mindless eating session. You have to be willing to say, oh, okay, like this happened, I did this, and now I feel bad, right? Because the willingness to be honest and sit with the bad feeling is the foundation of intrinsic accountability, and it's exactly what we're trying to avoid, right? But what happens when you're willing to sit with the bad feeling, you then, the next time something like this comes, you've banked that awareness and you've banked that initial root of intrinsic accountability, right? So next time this happens, I like to say that you resource this past experience and you can create a new boundary with yourself, right? Like you'll notice that if you're willing, and again, you have to be willing, you have to stay awake to this, you'll be like, oh, I'm almost at the place I was last time with this, right? So, you can use pizza as an example, right? right? We could think pizza's bad when we go past our edge. We could be like, oh man, I have no control over pizza. But that's really not true. You're just not, you haven't yet seen that eating a whole pie of pizza makes you feel bad. You haven't like sat with that and actually taken ownership and responsibility of that. Now, how to create intrinsic accountability is that next time that you're sitting with a pie of pizza, it's not just being like, oh my God, I can never have pizza again. Like, I guess I just can't be around pizza. Pizza is just my trigger. Like, I just can't do it. No, that's not how we heal emotional eating. That's not how we create a life with food that is loving, that is adventurous, that makes us feel free, right? That's not what we do. What we do is eat the pizza again. And this time, as we're getting close to that place where we went overboard last time, we draw on our intrinsic accountability and we say no, right? And we're like, nope, I'm stopping here, right? And the no isn't from like I was told that I can only have 2 slices of pizza in my diet or 1 slice of pizza, and the macros and the calories. Like, it's not that. It's coming from your intrinsic accountability, right? Because you are now more deeply connected to your feelings, values, and experiences as a holistic ecosystem, right? And you're holding yourself to a higher standard, right? So all of these things are now working together, right? You're connected to your feelings, you're taking responsibility for your behavior with food, right? You are making a choice and you're being with that choice, right? You're noticing how you feel and you're staying awake to the experience of eating, right? So, and then when you get to that place where perhaps, it might, you might go overboard, you then say like, oh, I went overboard before in the past, and I'm not going to do that now. And that is it. And the more that you do that, the less weird it is, right? Because in the beginning, I'll tell you it is weird, right? It is hard. I'm not going to say it's not hard. It is hard to put the boundary on yourself. It is much easier to outsource the accountability, outsource the boundary with a diet, a calorie limit, a meal plan. Oh, this doesn't fit. Someone told me it doesn't fit. This program says it doesn't fit or something, right? It's easier to do that because we don't have to deal with all like the messiness inside with all the, the brain is very loud in the beginning when it comes to this because we're not in touch with our feelings yet. We haven't developed that relationship with our feelings where it's loud enough, where we're like, okay, yes, I can listen to this part of myself. This is going overboard and feel like it's the right thing to do, right? When we first start, it's not trained up, that listening to our inner feelings, our inner voice. And that's actually also one of the reasons why we emotionally eat, right? Is because we're not that connected to ourselves. So intrinsic accountability is actually a huge pillar in healing emotional eating because the core tenet of intrinsic accountability is listening to yourself, right? The core tenet of intrinsic accountability is paying attention to yourself, paying attention to your experiences, to your choices, to your feelings about your choices, to the influences that are around you in your environment that influence your choices, right? So you have to be awake and pay attention. And when you do that, it gives you a lot of insight into your feelings. And we're not so caught up in our brain anymore. Like, is this right? Is this the wrong decision? Oh, am I depriving myself? Is this a diet? Oh, but I should be on this diet, right? Like we get kind of out of that heady thing, right? We're out of that, that headiness, the brain going a mile a minute, and we just get into our feelings. And when we get into our feelings, it's much simpler, right? It's much simpler. It's much more matter of fact. And it really does give us that feeling of certainty and resolution and confidence and empowerment in ourselves that we're looking for, right? So I just want to share a little bit about something even deeper than intrinsic accountability, because I could tell you about what intrinsic accountability is, but in order to be successful in sustaining intrinsic accountability as a massive pillar of your healing tapestry, right? So when you think of healing, there's a lot of different patches that go into it, right? A lot of different things that you build and that you bring into your life in order to heal. But to successfully have intrinsic accountability, one of the main things is believing that you deserve to feel good, right? So you have to, on a really core, deep level, believe that you deserve to feel good. And if you're listening to this, really ask yourself, like, do I really believe that I deserve to feel good? Right? Because wanting to feel good and believing that we deserve to feel good are two completely different things, right? Because you have to believe that feeling good isn't about instant gratification, right? Feeling good and having a sensation that makes us feel instantly gratified are not the same thing, right? And you'll start to discern the difference when you start to practice this, right? And you start to build your own intrinsic accountability, because in building intrinsic accountability, it's about trial and error. It's about going overboard in order to come back to balance, right? So you're going to see these things, and you'll know this because you gave into instant gratification many times and felt how ungood it made you feel, right? So to successfully have intrinsic accountability, you have to believe you deserve to feel good, and you have to believe that feeling good isn't about instant gratification, right? You know this because you gave into instant gratification many times and felt how gross and not good it actually made you feel, right? You know that having the whole pie of pizza doesn't make you feel good afterwards, right? And you then got honest with yourself, right? You understand that holding yourself accountable to feeling good can mean saying no to behaviors and sensations in the moment, right? And that includes food, right? That ultimately isn't aligned with how you want to feel and your goals, right? That includes eating food that ultimately isn't aligned with how you want to feel and your goals, right? And so when you can make decisions about eating from this place, you are in integrity, right? You are leveled up and you're truly empowered, right? So when you successfully are practicing this intrinsic accountability, you're not attached to the sensation of the moment thing, right? It doesn't feel as tempting. It doesn't feel as huge, right? You don't feel like it's black and white, like I have it all or I have to get it out of my face, right? Like you don't have that attitude about it anymore. Your nervous system doesn't go from, down here, from regulated to dysregulated in 4 seconds when there's a food around, right? You're able to come from a much deeper place, a much more integrated, right? Which is where the word integrity, integrity and integrated are similar words. You come from a place of integrity, an integrated place, and you can make a choice that is balanced, right? You can make a choice that is the middle, where you can enjoy and also have boundaries. And it's not this major, it's not this major thing, right? You're not it's not all or nothing. Okay. So it's really, really important to continue to practice this, right? And continue to see your life experiences as an opportunity to practice intrinsic accountability, right? And we can do intrinsic accountability in a bunch of ways, right? There's intrinsic accountability in the moment where, you put a boundary up, where you stop eating when you're full and not stuffed, right? There's intrinsic accountability where you start to recognize that it's up to you to make sure that you put yourself in situations where you're not triggered, right? And so you plan ahead, right? That's intrinsic accountability too, right? The idea of showing up somewhere and just seeing how it is doesn't really work for you anymore because you're not going to put yourself in that position to be dysregulated because you don't feel good in that state. And like we said, you've already accepted that feeling good is something you deserve to feel. And so therefore you're responsible to make sure happens. Yeah. So the benefits of intrinsic accountability are so vast, right? It's self-agency, it's empowerment, and ultimately, it is reducing the need for unhealthy coping mechanisms because we don't need to cope, right? We're so awake and present to, the reality of our lives, and we're not afraid of a little discomfort, right? We're not afraid of a little boundaries. We're not really afraid, right? So fear is less as well, right? And it's just so huge to live from this place. It's so big to be able to trust that your sense of groundedness, that your sense of feeling relaxed comes from you, right? And you have that power to create that internal environment for yourself. And though the external environment might be more chaotic, the fact that when your internal environment is aligned, you're really, really powerful, right? It's very empowering, and you are extremely powerful as a person for yourself. Okay, so one of the biggest things that I want to talk about is how to not only continue to get intrinsic accountability, but to bank it, right? And continue to bank it so that it becomes stronger in your nervous system than anything else, is to savor, right? So savoring is about tracking your progress, meaning paying attention and celebrating small wins, right? So an example would be, I'll keep going back to that pizza example, but it's actually giving yourself that pat on the back when you recognize that you're about to go overboard again, or, when you're, that's a great example. So you recognize you're about to go overboard again and you stop yourself, right? Like you say, oh, I remember last time I did this and I didn't feel well. I felt really bad physically. I felt guilty emotionally. So, I think maybe this might be a place to stop, right? And you don't know right away, right? You're kind of just like, you have to start from somewhere. And that's where you give yourself a pat on the back, right? No one is going to tell you this is the right decision. And this is the hardest part, right? Like no one is going to say, yes, you're right. This is exactly where you need to stop. There's no one telling you that, right? And that's why it's hard to do. So you have to say to yourself, yes, this is the right place to stop for me. And I know that because I think it is. And so I'm going to stop and I'm going to savor the fact that I feel really good in this moment, or I feel satisfied, I don't feel overstuffed. All the things you felt last time, you now don't feel. Now you might feel other things like It might feel weird. You might wonder if you're making the right decision. You might, feel a lack of confidence, right? There might be other things that start to come up that we have to start to deal with, but it's not guilt and gross, right? Which is what we get comfortable feeling. Okay. So in order to start to really have this intrinsic accountability become really in the forefront of your, almost of your behavior toolkit, so to speak, you need to consciously acknowledge when you are doing it, right? And then over time, it becomes kind of second nature. But in the beginning, you have to consciously acknowledge when you're doing it, okay? And another thing that's really helpful in the beginning, like I said, because it is kind of in the beginning could feel like a shot in the dark, almost like I said, no one's going to tell you you're making that this is the right thing. It is nice to have a support system, right? So I know for my clients, they love having me in their pocket every day when they're making these choices and they're imploring this intrinsic accountability, without having a roadmap, without having a rule guide from me, right? Just, the whole thing is like, do it, What's really helpful is that they have me as a safe space, right? To kind of share what's happening. And, so they don't get confused, right? They don't, like I said before, like they're not worrying that their intrinsic accountability is really deprivation or falling back into diet mentality, right? Like they're, or being overly preoccupied, right? Like it's worrisome because, like I said, it's a lot of attention at first. So it's nice to have a support system where you almost share the burden at first, right? And it's nice to have that because then it calms your nervous system down to get that validation that where someone says to you, yeah, that's a great job, like awesome, that's great. It's like you have a little cheerleader. And so having that support system is key. Okay. So savoring and support system are really, really important for intrinsic accountability. All right. So as you can tell, I love this topic of intrinsic accountability. I think it's huge, a huge, huge pillar for healing emotional eating, creating a loving relationship with eating, healthy behaviors with food, healthy attachments with food, confidence with yourself, empowerment in, your self-leadership, all that stuff. I really feel like developing this muscle is so key. But I want you to remember that it takes time and effort to learn, especially if it's new to you, right? Especially if you have never sourced accountability from the inside before. But I'll tell you that 100% it is worth it. So, you just know that by embracing intrinsic accountability, you can cultivate that resilience and reduce stress and replace any negative habits with positive ones. It just happens, right? All of these identity shifts you want to make, all of these standards that you want to embody are going to happen when you start to build the muscle of intrinsic accountability. So, yeah, so I'm just so happy that you're here. I'm just so happy that you listened to this episode today. And don't forget to join me again next week with another new episode about emotional eating, so we can learn all about developing healthy attachments with eating. You can start to lose weight, keep off the weight for good with sustainable strategies and long-lasting change. And just so you know, you can develop the skills to find a new calm, a new center for your inner self, and bring it into your daily life so you can be free from emotional eating. Until next time, I'm Alana, and thank you for listening to Emotional Eating Unwrapped.